have with us Teng Biao from the Grove Human Rights, who's a Grove Human Rights scholar at Hunter College, City University of New York, and the president of China Against Death Penalty. We have with us Cleo Pascal, who is an associate fellow, Chatham House, and non-resident fellow at the Foundation of Defense of Democracies. We're also joined by Adil Brar, a freelance journalist with the National Geographic Young Explorer and a former digital journalist at the BBC. Lastly, we have with us Dipanjan Roy Chaudhary, who is the diplomatic editor for the Economic Times, Foreign and Strategic Affairs. So thank you all for being here with us, and thank you so much to our audience as well. I would like to open the floor to Mr. Teng Biao for opening remarks. Please do go ahead.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm sorry. I'm not sure whether Abhinav covered this or not. The topic of this webinar is on the Chinese Communist Party's influence and espionage operations. Mr. Bao, over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to talk about how the Chinese Communist Party threatened global human rights and freedom. Because of the pressure from Chinese government, the academic freedom and the free speech have been threatened in the West and other countries. Many professors, scholars, and journalists, writers have been prevented from entering China. Their visa were denied, and His Holiness Dalai Lama was denied to enter many countries. And the 13 authors of this book were denied to enter China. And I was once invited by American Bar Association to write a book on Chinese politics and human rights. And then after I signed the agreement, they rescinded to publish my book would endanger their programs in China. And many other authors and scholars have a similar experience. Chinese government meddled in many elections, including Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, and United States. As to Taiwan, Chinese government issued the disinformation campaign through its official media and social media, defaming the DPP political figures and candidates, and also the economic blackmail. So every time there's an election in Taiwan, Chinese governments that give pressure to Taiwan government, and they are in favor of KMT, and they use the economic method to be against the DPP party. And what worse is Chinese government repeatedly used the military threat to Taiwan in order to interfere its election, the presidential election, also local elections. And Newsweek has exclusive reports that more than 600 groups in the American election. And Chinese Communist Party actually controlled and impact many influence operations in the United States and in all other countries. Famously, they are under the umbrella of the United Front Work, which is part of the Communist Party, like Confucius Institute is institute operated by the Ministry of Education of PRC, and CSSA and many other types of organizations like a Chamber of Commerce and Townsmen Association, Alumni Association, and Chinese language media. So many of these associations pretend to be organizations registering in the United States, and sometimes totally controlled by the Chinese embassy or Chinese Communist Party. Hoover Institution had a report on China's Communist Party's influence in the United States, and they found that almost all Chinese language media in the United States have been controlled by the Chinese government. And the method they use is to give pressure to the business, the companies who are willing to give advertisements to these newspapers. So gradually, those newspapers lost their advertisement, and then sometimes they were bought out by the Chinese authorities, and then most of these independent newspapers and the media outlets were controlled by the Chinese government, like the popular newspapers among Chinese diaspora community were journal or the Xingdao journal something. So only a few exceptions among Chinese language media in the United States and other countries, which are not controlled by the Communist Party. Chinese Students and Scholars Associations in many Western universities, the scholars and students from mainland China organize this kind of CSSA, but they got money from Chinese embassies and consulates, and they also received instructions from the Chinese authorities. And there have been many cases showing that CSSA threatens academic freedom in other countries. One case is the University of California, San Diego, invited Dalai Lama to give a speech, and then CSSA protested against this invitation. And after Dalai Lama delivered the speech, Chinese government punished the university by refusing all official scholars and students to study in this university. As of this year, there are more than 500 Confucius Institutes in the world. In the United States, the number is 75, and it used to be more than 120 Confucius Institute in the United States. And there are more than 1,000 Confucius classrooms. So it's supposed to be an institution focusing on Chinese language study and Chinese culture study, but actually they are part of the propaganda and brainwashing. To favor it, and by selecting teachers and training teachers and deciding the textbooks which follow from the party's propaganda and its own narrative, and so the one of the major events, major functions by of the Confucius Institute is to block sensitive speakers from being invited, and the sensitive topics being discussed, like Tibet, Xinjiang concentration camps, or Tiananmen, or Falun Gong, or Hong Kong, or torture. So they won't talk about this, and they prevented this kind of discussion from happening. So some influence operations are kind of soft power, but some are not soft at all. They are maybe soft power or hard power. The National Endowment for Democracy in the United States had a report on China's soft. These four journalists are Uyghurs, but they are American citizens. Because of their report on Uyghur issues, their relatives, their family members in Xinjiang, East Turkestan, were arrested and convicted. Some Brady is a scholar in New Zealand. Her research is on the influence of the Chinese Communist Party, the United Front work, things like that. And because of her research, her home and office were broken into, and her laptop was taken away. And for another time, her car tires were sabotaged. So it's a obviously a physical threat. This year, the Chinese National Congress passed the National Security Law in Hong Kong, and many Hong Kong activists have been arrested, including the famous Joshua Wong and the publisher Jim Lai. And what's even worse is Article 38 of this national security law targets everyone in the world. If you criticize Chinese government or Hong Kong government, if you kind of promote Hong Kong independence, and then you might be arrested and detained when you travel in Hong Kong or transfer a flight in Hong Kong. And last month, Samuel Chu, a Hong Kong activist but American citizen, was given the warrant issued by the Hong Kong police. So Hong Kong government is now targeting Hong Kong activists with American passport. Chinese government also forced the Uyghurs and Tibetans to be spies, to be informants for the Chinese Communist Party. In Turkey, in Netherlands, some Uyghurs were forced to provide information to Chinese state security, and one of them, a Uyghur person, was forced to do so, and last month, the November 3rd, he was shot by an unidentified person in Turkey and severely injured. Chinese secret agents even kidnap people on foreign soil. One famous case is the Causeway Bay book case. A publisher, Gui Minhai, who has Swedish passport, was kidnapped in Thailand. So Chinese Communist Party abducted a foreign citizen on foreign soil and sent them back to mainland China and securely detained and tortured. So it's really really horrible because Gui Minhai under the was the Chinese Gui Minhai reapplied Chinese passport. So imagine you are a foreign citizen, but all citizenship and Li Bo is the same case. Hong Kong UK passport was kidnapped in Hong Kong and sent back to China. The Chinese dissidents were kidnapped in Thailand and Burma, and they were all back to China and being sentenced to life imprisonment. And Wang Bingzhang is the forefront dissident, and he's still in prison and was sentenced to life and died in custody 3 years ago. The foreign policy has a report 2 years ago documenting how Chinese officials in Australia, in the United States, and other countries. NYPD officer, a Tibetan, a spy for and monitoring Tibet. So I've written an article describing how China went from 1989 to 1984. In 1989, the Tiananmen democracy movement and the Tiananmen massacre. But after totalitarianism, 1984 style totalitarianism, and it has been an increasing threat to global rights and freedom. So finally, I think we should examine the China policy for the past 3 decades or more. This engagement policy was not working, and many people, most scholars and the policy makers hoped that China would become an open society and liberal democracy. International legal organization and is going for quite should fight to counter by influence and the threat from the Chinese Communist Party. And thank you. I look forward comments and questions.
Thank you so much for those insights, Mr. Bao. This has been truly very informative. I think there was a bit of a technical issue towards the end of what you were saying, but I think I'll leave that for a little later. I'd like to bring in Cleo Pascal here and I'd request you to please also do share your insights and comments on the issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Sana Foundation for bringing forward this very important, crucial, and touchy topic. And I'd like to sort of personally pay my respects to Teng Bao for doing what he's doing. It's incredibly brave. He was quite modest about what he's had to go through in order to be able to be here with us and to be able to talk about these topics. But these are truly difficult times for anybody who is willing to stand up to the system. So I'd just like to acknowledge and thank him for all the work that he's done. And I recommend reading his books and his writings if you want to learn a little bit more about how difficult this is. I'm going to start off with a bit of a larger picture to try to define why China is doing this. I'll get to some of the techniques, although Teng Biao did summarize them extremely well. What is the goal for all of this activity? So from, if you're taking a look at some of the writings coming out of the Chinese think tanks, and this goes back to at least the early 90s, probably 1992, the goal is very overtly to advance the Chinese Communist Party's comprehensive national power, the comprehensive national power of China. And this is a concept that is very well defined, very focused, and empirical. The Chinese Communist Party ranks countries based on relative comprehensive national power, and the elements of that comprehensive national power are incredibly varied, but very specific. And they can include things like economic resources, human capital, natural resources, which, so in the case of things that India is seeing, things like access to water, but also control over rare earths globally, capital resources, so that things like FDI, knowledge and technology resources, which is where you see a lot of the intellectual property theft going on, government resources, military resources, international resources. There's this whole long list of things that go into the empirical definition that China uses to figure out what a country's comprehensive national power is. And so understanding, like the US would tend to say GDP military, but if you're looking from a Chinese perspective, it goes completely across the board. In 2014, Xi inaugurated, I'll read the quote, China's National Security Commission. And his definition of what this National Security Commission would do would be to integrate territorial security, military security, economic security, cultural security, social security, technological security, information security, ecological security, resource security, and nuclear security. This is an incredibly comprehensive way of looking at what they're trying to build up, the elements of a country that influence and espionage is designed to reinforce. So the question is, which is the topic of this, how do they do it? And again, looking to the Chinese sources, there are two frameworks that are very, I found personally very useful for understanding. The first is unrestricted warfare. This is a concept that was published by two Chinese Air Force colonels about the bottom line is, from a Chinese perspective, nothing is off the table. You can use any techniques you want, legal or illegal, in your approach to all these different kinds of securing all these different kinds of elements of comprehensive national power. So if you sign on to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, but there's parts of it that don't play in your favor around the South China Sea, completely legitimate to ignore those elements of it and to militarize at the same time and to use political pressure or bribery for other countries to try to reduce their claims on it. It's unrestricted. So if you're negotiating with the PLA in Ladakh and India is following the rules, don't expect the Chinese to follow the rules because they've said overtly their approach is unrestricted warfare. This is all published, this is all open. Within unrestricted warfare, there's also another concept of the three warfares, very specific again. So, and this is where we're getting much closer to the content of this topic, this particular seminar. They're looking at the three warfares are public opinion and media warfare, which is something that, so for example, if you are successfully countering the Chinese Communist Party narrative, they will try to discredit you. They'll try to control medias in other countries. If they don't like you, they'll shut you down. I think we have one of our participants is Jay Tabasu, who's the editor of the Sunday Guardian, and they didn't like what the Sunday Guardian was saying, and so it was blocked by the Great Firewall. So there's the blocking, and there's the proactive trying to co-opt other media or anything that can shape public opinion. Hollywood sees this a lot. You will not find a Chinese bad guy in a Hollywood movie anymore. It's very comprehensive. So that's the first of the three warfares, the public opinion media warfare. The second is psychological warfare. So that's things like running huge military exercises off the coast of Taiwan. That's a very overt example, but it is consistent. They will run the warships up and down the coast. They'll fly the planes. They'll push. They will try to use psychological tactics to scare entire countries into submission. And the third is legal warfare. And I think that you see this quite a lot, where the U.S. tried to ban WeChat, and we'll get to this later about what happened in India. But suddenly, out of nowhere, a WeChat users group popped up in the US and started fighting the ban in the courts, saying somehow it was restricting their freedom of speech to ban WeChat. So they'll use our legal systems very effectively to try to slow us down, to block us, whereas at the same time, completely ignore the legal systems if it doesn't help them. So to use some very specific examples, because one of the questions was about intelligence. We'll talk about two different types of intelligence. One is signals intelligence, and the other is human intelligence. In terms of signals intelligence, things like TikTok and WeChat are extremely effective. And I have to say, I have an enormous amount of respect for what India did when it banned all of those apps in June after the murder of the Indian soldiers on the border, because it showed that India understands China's attempt to increase its comprehensive national power through every means possible, including things like these apps. So TikTok, I don't have to tell an Indian audience, how much of a data sucker it was. It was pulling out metadata that could be used to weaponize, to advance AI weaponized systems improvements. It can be used for shaping public opinion. We saw that very much around the US presidential election, where there was a constant feed of kind of political manipulation attempts through TikTok by pushing pro-Biden videos and limiting access to some of the Trump stuff. And in fact, TikTok was used also to make it so that Trump was speaking to an empty stadium at some point, because they had done the tickets through TikTok, and organically or not, anti-Trump people had used it to have people buy up all the tickets and then not show up so that the stadium looked empty. That is, again, part of these three warfares. That's kind of psychological warfare on Trump and public opinion media warfare. The other thing about WeChat specifically is, if you have a company in China, because of the Great Firewall, you need to communicate to it through usually WeChat, which means that the party has access to all of your information about where you're procuring, who you're selling to, what your products are, your intellectual property, and they can use it to eventually, as the Director of National Intelligence said the other day here in the US, use it to essentially steal your company, replicate your company, and replace you in the market. So these apps become part of signals intelligence. They're a very useful tool for blackmail, for compromise information, that sort of stuff. And there are many other ways of doing it also. Obviously, Huawei is a very big one. But what's getting just now, I think, starting to get a little bit more attention is the human intelligence component of it. And we had have a story that broke here in the US in the last 24 hours of a Chinese spy, female Chinese spy, who apparently slept with a couple of Midwestern mayors. And she was also very close friends with a Democratic representative to the US Congress, Swalwell, who's on the Intelligence Committee, and who was one of the biggest proponents of Russia, of Trump being in hoc to Russia. And the way she did it, and this goes back to what Tang Bao was talking about in terms of things like universities, was this is a woman in sort of late 20s, early 30s. She enrolled at a university in California. She got into the student groups there, and a lot of it comes down to, you know, kind of Democratic Party's affiliation with identity politics, so you can get in there. And then she volunteered for these Democratic campaigns, and then miracle of miracles, she turned out to be quite a good fundraiser, and was delivered a lot of the Chinese community and the Chinese votes, and became quite closely linked with this guy, to the point where the FBI had to have a little meeting with him and say, you know, this might not be a great idea. And she left the country very quickly. We don't quite know what happened to her. But it's a long-term approach that finds the soft spots of the system and then embeds into the system. Another California member of Congress, Dianne Feinstein, her driver for 20 years was a Chinese spy. You know, so it's not, they have the money, they have the focus, they have the people, and they have a very specific goal, which is to advance this comprehensive national power. And they use proxies, so it's sometimes a lot more difficult to identify what's going on. In the case of India, one of the proxy entry points, because at this point, India knows what China is. So, you know, a lovely Chinese lady comes up to an Indian politician, he's not going to be quite that stupid. But because of the relationship with Russia, you're starting to see influence operations coming from China through Russia into the Indian system. And there's a lot of questions around things like the purchase of the S-400, which is a very touchy topic, because it would preclude advanced weapons cooperation with the US. You wouldn't be able to get the F-35s and some of the other stuff. And the US defense cooperation is moving ahead very, very quickly. So, you know, there may have been some commissions spread around by the Russians to buy the system, but apparently there was a lot more money than usual because it was being increased by Chinese contributions, because it really helps China if India buys the S-400, because it will, first of all, make it a little bit more difficult to cooperate with the US, and it's a system that they know very well anyway. They have it also. So the Chinese attempts to influence and control in order to advance their own comprehensive national power and limit the comprehensive national power of others comes in many, many different forms. Any vulnerability in your system you have, whatever's on your phone, whatever your legal system is, whoever you're letting into the country, who you think your friends are, make sure you know who the friends of your friends are, all the way across the board. The push is there, and it's not going to stop. There's a very good book that I'd recommend that just came out. It knows much more about this topic than I do. I'll hold it up. It's written by a former US Marine. It's called Political Warfare. It's by Dr. Kerry Gershanek, Professor Gershanek, and he goes into great detail about how Chinese political warfare operations in Thailand and in Taiwan have distorted some elements, especially in Thailand, the politics there. And he recommends that every member of the US, because the American US military and US political system, should have a 5-day course to understand how to identify Chinese political warfare. Because it is here, it is embedded, and it is affecting all of our systems in a fundamental way, and it's not going to go away. So I, again, applaud the Sana Foundation for bringing up this topic, and I like to show my gratitude to Tang Biao, who's on the front line of this, this is going to be something that we're going to have to live with, face, and fight for a very long time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cleo, for that amazing for those amazing insights. I'd particularly like to thank you for commending India's stand on our pushback on signal intelligence with banning apps following the gruesome murder of our soldiers on the Indo-China border. Thank you so much for acknowledging that, and it's truly something that that we've taken very, very seriously. So thank you. At this point, I'd like to bring in Adil Brar to share his views on the subject.
Thank you so much, everybody, for their remarks, and especially thank you to Teng Bia, who's on this call, and Cleo Pascal for the comments and the detailed analysis that was presented just now. Thank you to the Usana Foundation for having me over for this conversation. I'm just going to share something for everybody's reference. This is something that will be useful for the stuff that I'm going to talk about. Can everybody see my screen? Is it visible?
Yes.
Yes.
Hello? Okay. Thank you. Perfect. Sorry about that. There is no corresponding word for propaganda in Chinese. The closest we come to is Shunchuan, which is more aligned with the word publicity in English. So the sort of boundary between propaganda and publicity for the Communist Party is not really there. So that is why we should be paying attention to some of the state media, reports and analysis coming out of the Chinese mainland, and also the outlets which are based outside of China. Since I'm a journalist, I'm going to focus on the state media more so in terms of their propaganda and their role in the Chinese system. When the state media outlets say that they are doing propaganda for the Communist Party, they are engaging in public relations. The term also captures how Communist Party views journalism and the process of disseminating the information. There is a specific hierarchy within the state media outlets. Xinhua and People's Daily work at the ministerial level, while CCTV, PLA Daily, and some of the other media outlets work at the vice ministerial level. An outlet like Renmin Ribao or People's Daily, which is meant to disseminate information to the elites in Beijing, would say things differently as opposed to CGTN in English. The Chinese Communist Party has always controlled these media outlets, but there was an opening up of the Chinese media landscape between 2000 and until President Xi Jinping came into power in 2012. President Xi Jinping has sought to internationalize the Chinese state media operations and bring it more closely to the party's own vision of how China should be viewed around the world. In 2017, journalists in China were told to promote the country's achievements in the new era, which is one of the center points of President Xi Jinping's national ideology. According to the data provided by All China Journalists Association, China has approximately 200,000 journalists, and more than half of them work for official broadcasters. We know from the research by experts on Taiwan that journalists play an essential role in intelligence collection. And sometimes a lot of their reports don't even end up on the state media outlets. They are essentially prepared for intelligence collection, and they are passed along the propaganda department. Experts believe that reports and analysis are always written in a style that they can be read by the party officials. So there's that sort of neat little balance between what is put out by the state media outlets versus what is kept for the intelligence purposes. The chief editors of top state party mouthpieces are usually part of the central committee and the other state council bodies. In 2015, according to some estimates, the Central Propaganda Department had an annual budget of 2.5 yuan, which is approximately $400 million. We don't know the exact amount spent on propaganda operations every year, but based on the open source analysis and what we know, we can say that the budget has gone up significantly since 2015. As Freedom House's 2020 report says, the Chinese media and propaganda has seen a significant shift since 2017. This includes Russian-style social media disinformation campaigns, attempts to suppress any unfavorable views about China in foreign media, using social media platforms owned by Chinese companies to censor content outside of China, and state media outlets are using journalists to collect information, as I had mentioned earlier. We are now witnessing increasing coordination between state media outlets and pro-CCP accounts on social media. A prominent Twitter account by the name of Eva Zheng also has similar social media presence on Weibo and WeChat. I have personally observed that there is almost a real-time syncing of information flow between Weibo, WeChat, and Twitter. The stories and information flow between Chinese language social media platforms and English language social media platforms such as Twitter and Facebook has almost become instantaneous. This also means that China's disinformation campaigns are becoming more efficient, but they have yet to match Russia's disinformation campaign style. In August 2019, Twitter suspended almost 900 accounts that were deliberately set up to spread a political discord in Hong Kong and around the world. I want to highlight this similarity between China's own disinformation campaign and what Russia has been doing. China is still sticking to disinformation, classic disinformation campaign, which is done through social media platforms. We haven't seen any kind of active measures that Russia has adopted, which we saw during the 2016 election with the hacking of the DNC server. But China's capabilities are growing, and we should be paying attention to how China seeks to emulate Russia's strategy. Trump administration has taken some serious steps to stop such disinformation campaigns. The actions on Chinese state media outlets have led to equal reaction from the PRC, and we have seen certain journalists being forced to leave China, and now they are working out of Seoul or Taipei, and they're no longer based in Beijing. Even Hong Kong is considered relatively unsafe now. The Chinese state media has spent a lot of energy over the past few months to report the rising number of COVID-19 cases in the US. And there has been a particular focus on US's quote-unquote failures to tackle COVID-19. And I think the intended purpose of this sort of reporting is to sow discord and to use disinformation strategies to highlight how US is failing in its COVID-19 response. Chinese state media has been very active in creating these COVID-19 related narratives, from citing obscure research, which has failed to pass peer review, to giving ear to any sort of conspiracy theories which have been already challenged by experts, and there is no validity to any of these conspiracy theories. In recent days, state media have used obscure research to blame Australia and even India for being the origin of COVID-19. And we know there's little evidence to suggest otherwise, or that China is the actual source of COVID-19. China likes to keep the level of conflict below a certain threshold. And that is something even Cleo Pascal just highlighted, that China has used unrestricted warfare. But I will argue that they always like to keep the conflict below a certain threshold, just so they are not in sort of public attention and nobody is paying attention to their activities. And that's the precise reason we should be more aware of the disinformation campaigns being used by Chinese government more so now. And under President Xi Jinping, we have seen a shift in China's diplomatic engagement with the rest of the world. China's diplomats and journalists are ever more aggressive. And we could very well see something like a Russian disinformation and active measure campaign coming out of China in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that, Adil. At this point, I would like to bring in, just a second. Thank you. Sorry. Apologies. At this point, I'd like to bring in Dipanjan Roy Chaudhary from the Economic Times to please share his views on the subject. You'll need to unmute yourself. Dipanjan, you'll need to unmute yourself.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good evening to Dr. Pandya for inviting me to this forum. And good evening to everyone, my co-panelists, as well as others in India and wherever they are based. I'm not an academic, so I'm going to look from a different, more from a journalistic perspective. And I have certain different views from some of the speakers, and I would come to that in a couple of moments. India, in my experience in the last 20 years that I have been a journalist and following the Indian foreign policy evolving and the influence of foreign actors in the last 12 years, closely in the last 12 years. I think every foreign player tries to influence, so that is not the point, whether it's USA or whether it's Russia or whether it's China, everybody tries to use, of course, tries to use various ways to influence foreign policy. Now, there are, of course, benign intentions and benign powers, and there are, of course, different interests. And I'm not getting into what the US has done over the decades in various parts of the world. Of course, that may not have been as dangerous as what the Chinese are doing on either trying to undermine the established norms of international order, because the Chinese think that wants to have a mix of their what they call their system into the international order, or shape the international order as per based on their ethos and their culture and their civilization. And we have reached today's situation because successive US governments, in my opinion, have given them this space. The West and the US in particular have given them the space to occupy such a position in today's geopolitics, because in order to, at some point of time, when President Nixon was in power, in order to reach out to the Communist Party of China to create or to deepen the Sino-Soviet split and to split the communist world, they started a kind of a journey which has resulted in today's situation where we see China trying to dominate the geopolitics and the geoeconomics. And over the years, as US has left the various international organizations. They have been withdrawing from various international organizations, including the outgoing President Trump's decision to withdraw from WHO. These are decisions which, to my mind, is a bit irrational, and it is inexplicable, because this has, of course, given the Chinese the opportunity to dominate these organizations, to put in the funds, and we all know how the Chinese have won the elections in many of these international bodies, and therefore trying to shape, with the aim to shape the international order. With the espionage activities, with the aim of controlling the geopolitics, is what is statecraft is closely involved with the aim to control the geopolitics, and the Chinese have certain distinct style in doing this. And I think that they are not just copying a particular country. I think they have copied both their big neighbor in what they're doing, as well as the American system in conducting espionage activities. And I have seen how they have tried to follow even in a Western model, or a model that is being practiced in other parts of the world, in the Western part of the world, to penetrate India and in the Indian neighborhood. From offering junkets to journalists, to trying to influence the officials, and trying to influence the lawmakers in various countries in South Asia and Southeast Asia, to trying to also penetrate into the to the Chinese community, the Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia. They have been successful in some countries. They have not been successful in certain countries. They have tried to dominate the dynamics of this region, particularly in the ASEAN, and now coming to penetrate into the neighborhood, in India's neighborhood. If I may give example, in one of the countries in India's neighborhood, they not only have tried to cultivate the journalists by taking them on pleasure trips to China, but also offering fellowships to the offsprings of these journalists, including offsprings who are in the teenage, or even sub 10. So they have tried to kind of influence them, and therefore try to kind of mold opinion in those countries, and have been successful through the businessmen. And when businessmen in certain countries have also have become lawmakers, they of course work with a strategy, and this is not a strategy which China, I think, is the inventor of this strategy. This strategy has been invented invented in the past, and they have, in everything that China has mastered reverse engineering. So whether it's a statecraft, or whether it's building an aircraft, or whether it's building an aircraft carrier, it's reverse engineering that what they have done. I don't think there's typically Chinese characteristics of any statecraft that they have been doing. It is copy from various countries. It's a copy from other P5 countries. So let's not get into whether it's the unique Chinese way of being of a statecraft. In India, unlike one of the speakers mentioned, Mr. Teng mentioned about the Confucius Institutes in US, and how they have been successful. In India, the Confucius Institutes never took off in a big way, except for West Bengal, where they have been tried, and that too, the consulate of the Chinese consulate in Calcutta was funding those institutes. In JNU, it never took off. It never took off in Mumbai University, and in South also. They tried to introduce Confucius Institute interestingly through an engineering college, and they were funding that, and that has also been stopped. in the think tank circuit is in India is still, I would say, in its initial years. If I compare it with the US and UK and other countries, we still don't have area specialists in many think tanks, and we have very good upcoming scholars, even in their 20s and 30s coming up. So the Chinese have tried to kind of penetrate in some of these think tanks, but I wouldn't say that they have been hugely successful. At least in India, they have not been hugely successful. Maybe in one of the Indian northern neighbors of India, they have been successful. Maybe in the eastern neighbor, they have been successful, and of course in the western neighbor, but not yet in the Indian circuit, the think tank circuit yet. And now post COVID, and with the current crisis along the line of actual control, I don't think that the Indians will be welcoming, or Indian experts will be welcoming the the penetration by the China, or attempts at penetration by the diplomats of the Chinese embassy here in India. They of course I have tried to use corporates to penetrate here. Tried to in activities through various kind of try to probably recruit independent analysts, try to kind of but it's not they have not been, in my opinion, they have not been able to. The India was or is a test case for China, in terms of, because by psychologically since 1962 we have been very, very wary of the Chinese. I have grown up in Calcutta hearing the common people of the very, despite a left front government and of this Communist Party of India, Marxists, their links with the Chinese Communist Party was a fallout of the Sino-Soviet split, and where the Communist Party of India was close to the Soviets, and the Communist Party of India, Marxist, was close to the Chinese. But I could never see a huge penetration in Calcutta in terms of common intelligentsia and others. The number of intelligentsia traveling to China, it can. I think there are more American or Western think tankers who have traveled to China in the last 30 years in their goal to understand China, or enter into collaboration, or enter into other kind of lobbying, or any other kind of collaborations. But in India, it has not been that kind of that number of Indians traveling to China, intelligentsia traveling to China, I can count on hands. When the Belt and Road, for the first Belt and Road Summit was being held in 2017, there were definitely attempts by China to influence the public here through think tanks. It was they did organize a seminar and brought out a paper with a particular think tank here, but it did not cut much eyes. The government, because the think tank also closely works with the government, but it did not cut much eyes with the Ministry of External Affairs, and India was the first country to call the bluff, with regard to Belt and Road initiative, and other countries were signing. They were on a spree of signing on the projects, and India was the only country which has never been represented at the political level. I think we called the bluff much before the West called the bluff, or by the time the second summit came. And I see today, there are people in Europe writing books on Belt and Road Initiative, but still, while the Communist Party is, I'm surprised to see in the West an amount of literature is coming out on the human rights violation and the Communist Party of influence and all the nefarious activities. But the debate on Belt and Road is still very weak. In India, I have written extensively on Belt and Road from day one, from 2017, when I realized that how big trap is being created for all the countries across the continents. But of course, I'm not aware of certain literature, certain languages like Spanish or Portuguese or Italian, what are being written in those languages on Belt and Road Initiative. But of course, the awareness has increased, but I'm afraid it's still not, and in Indians and Indian journalists and in think tanks when we're not afraid to, write critical pieces of China, So you have to, while the Chinese have tried very hard penetrating in India, they have, apart from the financial fintech sector, and the apps which were used as espionage tools, the Indian society, the Indian intelligentsia, and I would, were guarded. They may have interacted. They are more, and the Galwan incident. I would earmark the June 15, 2020 as a watershed. The date is a watershed in Indo-Sino-Indian relations, India-China relations. That the Galwan changed a lot of dynamics. I can say with some degree of experience that if there was no killing of the Indian soldiers and if there was a standoff like it happened in Sungramchu in between 87 and 1993, one would not have seen, one would not have seen this kind of animosity in intelligentsia and public opinion as it is on today. The guarded people have become now have now have an antagonistic kind of approach towards China. This wouldn't have happened if there was no Galwan. I would like to end with one correction with Miss Cleo Pascal, and they would like to correct a comment because I have been following up at certain foreign policy developments. I don't, in my opinion, and I have covered, India-US relations, India-China relations, and India-Russia relations, and I don't think there was the Chinese penetrating or giving commissions to India through Russia. I don't think that's a correct, but neither a correct information nor a correct perception that one should harbor. There is no such, there is no such. Incident. If somebody is trying to create, or if there is some I think it's incorrect. There is no such that the Chinese would work here through the Russians is not a right perception, because the Soviet and Russian are here for the last 70 years, and they don't need the Chinese to kind of sell a defense product in India. On S-400, the India and Russia was in talks much before even China bought the S-400 from Russia. India and Russia were in talks to have S-400 from the very year Russia started making the S-400 systems. So India buying the S-400, and because China is happy, I don't think that's a very correct perception of that particular development. And India is not in the race, or not even considering to buying F-35. So some scholars in US may think about it, but there's no such proposal. There have been some proposal in the year or something that we are not even there anywhere near buying even F-21, so F-35 is out of question. So buying an S-400 to stop F-35, and the US is just out of, it's still an imagination, and there is no such there is no truth in that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chaudhary, for that. I think we may have differences in the technicalities of comments between speakers, but I think all of us can unanimously agree that China's sheer ruthless hegemony and their penetration, into various sectors, including the media, education, think tanks, is definitely a cause of very, very grave concern, not just in the the Asian region, but also the world over. So on that note, I first of all like to thank all our speakers for their opening comments. We'd we do have a few questions here, which I would like to, which we should address at this point. The first question here is for Mr. Tang Biao. So recently, John Ratcliffe, the director of the National Intelligence in the US, said that China has conducted tests on humans to make biologically enhanced soldiers. What would you like to say about this?
Thank you for this question. I'm not expert on military or science. I'm an expert on human rights and law and politics in China. From the viewpoint of human rights, Chinese Communist Party never respects human rights and freedom. And so this kind of soldier, the bio soldiers, I think they don't respect morality or basic ethic or the law and constitution made by itself. And it reminded me of the organ harvesting Chinese government that took organs from the Falun Gong members and political dissidents and Uyghurs. Another thing is a few years ago, a Chinese scientist He Jiankui made the gene edited babies. So you can see how far this dictatorial regime can go in terms of abusing science and technology.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you for that, Mr. Tangria. The next question we have here is for Cleo Pascal. Abhishek Karatkar asks, how is 5G technology by Huawei involved in espionage? And could you explain why was it banned in the US and other countries, as it's assumed? Is it because of its assumed involvement in espionage?
not just espionage, but manipulation. We had China thinks, and may or may not be correct, that the world is heading more and more online, Internet of Things and AI, and they've launched a competitor to GPS, Baidu, all that sort of stuff. And that is the realm that they very overtly want to control. So Huawei is a brand, but it produces multiple sorts of technologies. So there's the kind of sucking up of data, that's fine, but there's also the manipulation of data, which is a whole different problem. And we saw it. There was a very good report done, and I'll put some links in the chat box. I already put the link to the book that I mentioned in the chat box. It's free. You're welcome to download it for free off the site, off the Marine University Press site. And there was another report, I'll put the link also, about what happened with the South Korean elections in April 2015. As it happens, the report was also written by another former Marine, retired US Marine colonel, who was written for the Sunday Guardian, about how they had the vote counting machines had Huawei components in them. And there's a lot of, the results of the elections went very much in favor of the party of Moon, and it gave him almost enough votes within Congress to change the constitution. And the numbers were extremely peculiar. The investigation shows that it looks like something happened. And one of the entry points potentially is through the Huawei technology that was in the South Korean systems. Now, it's good idea not to get caught up in specific brand names. We know Huawei's a problem. And we know that China knows that we know Huawei's a problem. So consistent with how the Chinese Communist Party works through deception and diversion and distraction, what we would expect to happen now is for them to start to try to co-opt what we think of as clean brands, there's a push for clean technology now, and a global clean tech system, which would be, for example, it's been proposed to have a D10 of technology, which would be the G7 countries plus India, South Korea. I can't remember who the three are, but the idea is that South Korea would be one of them. Now, if China has increasing influence within South Korea and a linkage into Samsung, we have to relook at Samsung. It's not just Huawei. Huawei has become so overt as a problem that the Chinese Communist Party will definitely try to get into UK technology companies, French technology companies, companies that we think of as clean, as a Trojan horse into our clean systems. So it's a huge problem. I'm just going to very quickly summarize some of the other links that I'm going to put in, because some really good comments were made. Adil mentioned that China keeps below the threshold, and I think he's absolutely right. The question, but what it's also doing is continuously testing that threshold. So I think that, for example, what happened in Galwan was, I think they thought the Indian threshold was a lot higher than it actually was. So the response from the Indian side surprised them, and so then they back up, and they do it consistently. They push until there's a pushback, and then they retreat, and then they maybe push from the side or push in another direction. In the case of the Himalayas, they might be pushing in through Nepal. So that idea of keeping below the threshold is really important. And I think that what's happening now in the context of the US is they're going to be testing what Biden's threshold is. So we need to kind of stay aware of how close they're getting to the threshold and how quickly you have to push back on that threshold. I'm going to just super quick. I completely agree with Dipchen that that China's not the only country that does political warfare. It's in the Arthashastra. It's in Sun Tzu. It's been around for a super long time. As long as we've had countries kind of go up against each other, this has been an element of it for thousands of years. What's unique to China, and I'll put the link to an article from Claus, from an Indian military think tank, is the concept of comprehensive national power, which is the goal. The tool is political warfare, but the goal is to advance comprehensive national power. And the article explains why that's unique to modern China. I'm also going to put a link into, there's a video that came out within the last 48 hours of a Chinese professor talking about political influence in the US and how they had a problem with Trump because they already had heavy influence in the inner circles of the US political system. He's very overt about it. It's in Chinese, but there are English subtitles. So I'll put all of this stuff down the side, and I'll also put in an article by Jaita about Russia-China. I learned an enormous amount about geopolitics from the Indian media, who is much more open and overt about having these conversations than we are in the West. So I'd recommend, don't take my word for it, take a look for other Indian experts who are more advanced in having to deal with this. We haven't lost people to the PLA in a very long time. So it's not as front in our mind, and we're heavily compromised. So I'd recommend looking again to Indian experts. Don't take my word for it. Okay, I'll put the links in the side. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Cleo, for that. So the next question that we have, it's a three-part. It's a two-part question, which has a bigger question sort of attached. So this is a question that I'm opening to all our panelists. So in terms of the CCP, say, funding, just give me a second, I'll just pull it up. Yeah. So in terms of the CCP funding dissidents and terrorists in India's northeastern region, or even buying off, Indian intellectuals to speak up against the Indian state, how can they be isolated and called out internationally? Who would like to take this question? Dipanjan?
Could you repeat it again?
So in terms of the CCP, how would them, funding dissidents and terrorists in in India region, or even buying off Indian intellectuals to speak up against the Indian states, in the light of this, how can the world call them out internationally, and how can they be isolated?
Um, in terms of the, I would rather focus a bit on the insurgents in Northeast. See, we have to also, when you are talking about China and the Chinese intentions in South Asia, in the Indian neighborhood and extended neighborhood, I would say, between Afghanistan to Thailand, one has to also keep the Pakistan factor in mind. Today we see, because Pakistan is the second biggest country in South Asia after India. The focus from day one has been to trying and in a very impractical approach of trying to match India for penny by penny, arms by arms and and they have failed miserably in their quest. So today, a lot of the Pakistani attempts by Pakistan to revive its influence or quote unquote goodwill is being funded by China. So if you see Pakistani attempts to reignite tensions or because some insurgents have been one of the insurgent leader have been caught trying to along the Bangladesh and Meghalaya border, which to me looked like, and in my understanding looked like, it's an attempt to reignite, the insurgency in Northeast. So the Chinese have stopped active funding of the insurgents in Northeast from the mid to the late 80s. The insurgent groups, some of the insurgent groups came into talks. Others died its own death. They were defeated by the Indian forces. So, there are a couple of leaders still based in China, and one of them is Paresh Barua, and he had fled just before the elections in Bangladesh in 2008 because he anticipated Sheikh Hasina is coming back to power. And he fled, and he fled via a place called Ruili, which is in the Myanmar Arunachal China Tri Junction. So so he is there, and there would still, I believe, NSA and IM, which is the Northeast's biggest insurgency and Asia's oldest insurgency, is the Naga insurgency. And there are NSA and IM is an offshoot of the Naga National Council, and they would still have some support from China, in not in the way of the 60s and 70s, but definitely where China Pakistan would work closely in on these projects. So would be in Nepal, I'm sure. So would be in Sri Lanka, because at some point of time the Pakistani military had close links with the Sri Lankan military. But many of these countries, today every country, even we cannot really undermine any country because it's a small or in comparative size, because every country today is smart, and they hedge, including in Sri Lanka. And if anybody is saying Rajapaksa brothers are pro-Chinese, and but the Rajapaksa brothers are also hedging, they know that they have to work with India, they want good relations with India, so everybody is hedging today. It's not a zero-sum game, in my opinion, and as I have seen it. In terms of intellectual, maybe some indirectly they have tried to kind of influence some intellectuals here and there, but the language is a big problem in China. And some intellectuals going there and addressing in some seminars and all. There are people who have been going to the Chinese universities but have been very critical of China. They have been visiting both PRC as well as ROC. They are still, because what we are looking at is also a Xi Jinping phenomena. Some of these things didn't probably, the Hu Jintao or a Jiang Zemin period were different. Of course, they slowly created a kind of, they were in this project. And I would again going to say that, what we witness today, it's because the West thought that they could mainstream the Communist Party of China, and they have miserably failed. And in this process, for years the focus was on West Asia, and then the Chinese got just carte blanche to kind of enter and penetrate various system, and here we are.
Yeah, as a follow-up to that, Mr. Dipanjan, what would you say about, say, Chinese influence ops in India in terms of media in particular? Like during the COVID outbreak, for example, we had newspapers openly running Chinese sort of advertisements.
No, I think there was only one newspaper. One newspaper. See, newspapers in India are not running by the diktat of the government of the newspapers in India run because they need advertisements. Yes, some made some judgmental error. Maybe they shouldn't have. Our newspaper never went for any kind of advertisement from the Chinese side. Either in any kind of either advertorial or any kind of advertisement. But some newspaper made some judgmental error. But it would be you can't like New York Times can't be told that you don't entertain an author from Pakistan or an entertain from somewhere or from Turkey just because the government of somebody in DC doesn't like it. So the newspapers make their own choices. The advertising team doesn't talk to the editorial team to make their choices. There has been some judgment of error, and for them, they have been kind of. I'm sure that they may face some problem from the Indian Information Broadcasting Ministry in getting the information ads. But you can tell this to an All India Radio and Doordarshan, but how can you tell Indian newspaper or a television channel not to take an advertisement from anybody? If it was submitted, if an Indian newspaper publish full page ads from Taiwan, and my paper last year even wrote that ambassador of Taiwan and the Chinese embassy created a big ruckus over it, and I put my foot down that we are going to go. I put my foot down in the sense I told also the advertorial team that they should not offer an apology later. This year, the Chinese embassy was very upset with me that why did I carry the interview of Dol Kunisa, who is the leader of the World Uyghur Congress. He's based somewhere in Europe, and I don't want to name that. And but so be it. They also tried to kind of threaten me on a piece on Taiwan. But that's it. I have been to Taiwan even before I went to PRC. I have a distinction certificate from Taiwan, so I really couldn't. It's not because I'm neither a beneficiary per se of Taiwan or ROC, and I don't see. I don't take. I as a journalist don't take any pleasure trips or any such trips from any country. So many times, many countries I have refused because it was not serving any of my journalistic endeavors.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank all our panelists here. This is a topic that we could that can sort of go into a discussion for hours more, I'm quite sure. But for the sake of time, I think this would be a great place to sort of put a hard stop on things. Thank you all very much for joining us. I would, at this point, like to invite the CEO of the Usanis Foundation, Mr. Abhinav Pandya, for closing remarks and a vote of thanks. Hopefully, if his connection is a lot better.
Thank you, Shahana. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. I would like to thank all our esteemed speakers, and my humble apologies for the initial disruption in the internet. Sometimes these things are just unavoidable, especially when we are talking about China, and in particular, banning all those apps. We expect some kind of disruption. So I find that. And thanks for all the speakers for this amazing discussion. And indeed, it's a big problem, especially for democracies, the freedoms and constitutional guarantees process of countering China's influence in espionage operations is a big challenge. This is something which, I mean, I wouldn't say new. It has traditionally been a part of the statecraft, but it has emerged as a big challenge in good combination with the new technological developments and this very passionate and I would say a very expansionist zeal which the Chinese Communist Party has displayed in establishing its hegemony, be it at any cost, going completely ruthless about it. So that is a major cause of concern. But here I also see a silver in the cloud. In our entire discussion, we often talk about China winning the battle without fighting, winning the battle without fighting. Perhaps the world communities should think about giving them what they don't want, and that is fighting. If their strategy is to win without fighting,